Picture this. It's 1933. The Great Depression has its hands around America's throat, and somewhere in a flooded Connecticut factory, a two-time Harvard dropout, a man with thick glasses, a noticeable limp, and absolutely zero engineering credentials, is building a 19-foot aluminum torpedo on 3 wheels. He claims it can hit 120 miles per hour. He claims it can carry 11 people. He claims it's the most aerodynamically advanced vehicle on Earth. 3 months after the world first sees it, it kills someone. His response? He calls it the most stable car ever built. This is the story of the Dymaxion. And if you've never heard of it, buckle up, because this thing was decades ahead of its time, genuinely dangerous, and somehow, against all logic, became one of the most fascinating machines ever built. And before we get into it, if you're into forgotten history, engineering disasters, and the kind of stories that somehow didn't make it into your textbooks, hit that subscribe button now. Because we do exactly this every single week. To make sense of the Dymaxion, you first have to understand the man who willed it into existence. Richard Buckminster Fuller was born in 1895 inches Milton, Massachusetts. New England intellectual family. High expectations. The kind of household where Harvard wasn't a goal, it was simply what happened next. Except Fuller had other plans. Or rather, no plan at all. His first semester, he took his entire tuition fund to New York City and spent every last dollar throwing a lavish dinner party for the cast of the Ziegfeld Follies. Not a small gathering. A full, extravagant blowout. Harvard showed him the door. His family pulled strings, got him readmitted, and sent him to work in a Canadian textile mill, first figuring a little hard labor might knock some sense into him. It didn't. Harvard expelled him a second time, citing, with remarkable understatement, irresponsibility and lack of interest. Now here's where it gets interesting. This man, 5'2", legally blind without his thick corrective lenses, walking with a limp because one leg was shorter than the other, was about to spend the next 6 decades trying to redesign the modern world. And a surprising amount of the time, he'd actually pull it off. After the war, where he served in the Navy and actually showed real promise, inventing a rescue winch that could haul downed aircraft out of the water fast enough to save pilots' lives, he bounced between careers. Meatpacking, construction. He and his father-in-law developed a lightweight, fireproof building system called Stockade. They raised capital. They attracted investors. Then the whole thing collapsed. And then, in 1922, his 4-year-old daughter Alexandra died of polio and meningitis. Fuller convinced himself the damp, poorly built housing they'd been living in had contributed to her death. That guilt became something he carried for the rest of his life. By 1927, he was 32 years old. No job, no money, a drinking problem. Standing at the edge of Lake Michigan, looking at the water, calculating whether his wife and newborn daughter Allegra would be financially better off if he simply wasn't around anymore. He didn't jump. Instead, something shifted. He made a decision, one that sounds almost absurdly grandiose, until you see what he eventually built. He decided to dedicate every remaining year of his life to one single question. What can one ordinary person, with no resources and no institutional backing, actually do to make life better for everyone? He called himself Guinea Pig B. The B was for Buckminster. That is the man who decided to reinvent the automobile. Here's the thing. Though Fuller didn't set out to build a car, what he wanted to build was something that could travel on roads, on water, and through the air. An omni-medium transport. A machine that laughed at the concept of infrastructure. The problem was that jet propulsion was still years away, and vertical takeoff technology existed only in theory. So he did what any reasonable, unreasonable person would do. He decided to build the ground taxiing phase first and figure out the flying part later. His sketches from 1928 show something that looks less like a car and more like a landed spacecraft. Inflatable wings, 3 wheels arranged like aircraft landing gear, a fuselage shaped like a teardrop. His friend, the sculptor Isamu Noguchi, built stunning scale models that ended up published in a design magazine called Shelter, which Fuller himself was editing at the time. The designs attracted attention, and eventually that attention translated into money. A 30-year-old Philadelphia socialite named Anna Biddle saw what Fuller was building and decided to write a check. Before doing so, Fuller laid down what he called the ice cream cone clause. If he decided to spend the development funds on ice cream cones and nothing else, that was entirely his business, and she would ask no questions. Biddle agreed. She handed over $1,000 to get started. With that money, Fuller recruited a partner. Starling Burgess was a legendary naval architect. He'd designed America's Cup yachts, but he was also freshly bankrupt after a string of failed marriages. Broke, brilliant, and available. Fuller and Burgess rented floor space in an old automobile factory in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and started hiring. It was March 1933. Roosevelt had just been inaugurated. The Depression was at its worst. 1,000 men lined up outside that factory for 27 open positions. Some of them, reportedly, cried when they found out they'd been hired. For the engine, they bought a brand new Ford Tudor sedan for $450 and stripped it completely. The heart of the Dymaxion would be Ford's Flathead Vive 8, 85 horsepower. Freshly revolutionary, the engine that had just made V8 power affordable for regular working people for the first time. Before this motor, 8 cylinders were for Cadillacs. Now any farmer could have one. It wasn't without its issues. The exhaust routing ran heat directly through the engine block. Overheating was a persistent problem. Cracked blocks weren't rare. The cooling system was barely holding on even under normal operating conditions. Fuller's plan was to take this already temperamental engine, mount it backward in a vehicle it was never designed for, and run the drive forward through universal joints to power the front wheels. Front-wheel drive with a rear-mounted engine. In 1933, Burgess, the boatman, pushed hard for an air-cooled aviation engine. Fuller said they couldn't afford it, and overruled him. The chassis was aircraft-grade steel, drilled through with lightning holes to cut weight. The body was built exactly like a racing yacht, an ash-wood skeleton covered in hand-shaped aluminum panels, topped with a canvas roof painted tight and smooth, lightweight, unusual, utterly unlike anything else on the road. The workshop flooded. They moved. Burgess kept disappearing to work on a yacht he was building for a society lawyer. Fuller gained weight and drank too much. His wife wrote letters telling him that the little time they spent together was wasted on his lecturing and complaining. The budget spiraled. Biddle kept signing checks. Then, on July 12, 1933, Fuller's 38th birthday, the first Dymaxion prototype rolled out of the factory doors. The name was Pure Fuller. A combination of dynamic, maximum, and tension. He slapped it on everything he ever created. Dymaxion House, Dymaxion Map, Dymaxion Sleep Schedule. If Fuller's hands touched it, it became Dymaxion something. The car was 19 feet long. It weighed approximately 2,700 pounds. A standard Ford sedan of the same era ran about 14 feet and weighed 2,200 pounds, and you could buy one off a lot for under $700. The Dymaxion cost $8,000 to build, 3 wheels, 2 in front, 1 at the rear. That rear wheel did all the steering. Operated through steel cables like a ship's rudder. It could pivot a full 90 degrees, which meant the car could perform a U-turn within a circle not much larger than its own body length. In demonstrations, Fuller would pull alongside a traffic officer, rest his hand on the man's shoulder, and drive a complete circle around him without losing contact. Crowds loved it. It genuinely was remarkable to watch. The interior seated up to 11 passengers. It was cooled by dry ice. A single headlamp sat up front. A crumple zone made of balsa wood sat behind it. And instead of a rear window, the Dymaxion had a periscope mounted on the roof. No windshield wipers, because Fuller was convinced the aerodynamic profile would simply shed rainwater on its own. It did not shed rainwater on its own. Fuller claimed a top speed of 120 miles per hour and fuel efficiency of 40 miles per hour. Gallon. Here's the honest version. The car probably hit around 90 miles per hour at its absolute fastest in any public setting. Fuel economy in real driving conditions was closer to 22 miles per gallon, maybe 35 under ideal circumstances. Still legitimately impressive for a vehicle of that size. But far from what Fuller was telling people. And then there was the question of how it actually handled. Would you have gotten behind the wheel of this thing? Keep that question in mind. During early testing in April, engineers discovered something alarming. At speed, the single rear wheel caused the car to lean into corners while the front tires held perpendicular to the road. Above certain velocities, this produced a violent oscillation, something drivers might generously describe as unsettling and more accurately describe as terrifying. They installed a hinge to reduce it. Somewhat. But the deeper problems weren't fixable with a hinge. Rear-wheel steering is perfectly logical on forklifts. It works on ships. On a 20-foot road vehicle moving at highway speed, it becomes a different proposition entirely. The system had no self-centering mechanism, meaning the driver had to constantly apply small corrections, like holding a ship's tiller in a steady current, never letting go. The steering ratio was 30-1. That's an enormous amount of wheel input for a modest amount of response. Worse, the weight distribution was severely biased toward the rear, where the Ford 5.8 sat just ahead of that single steering wheel. At speeds above 40 miles per hour, aerodynamic forces began generating lift under the tail. The faster the car moved, the lighter the steering wheel felt in the driver's hands. Not lighter in a reassuring way, lighter in a way that indicated the rear of the car was quietly departing the surface of the earth. In crosswinds, it became genuinely dangerous. The car would weather vane into any strong gust, rotating to face the wind like a weather vane on a barn roof. Fuller acknowledged this openly, said he wouldn't let other drivers take it out on gusty days, and that he practically had to fly it down the highway himself. In his mind, this was a promising sign. The car wanted to fly. He was building the flying version next anyway. Nobody else saw this as a feature. Fuller sold the first prototype to Gulf Oil for $2,500, far below cost, but they needed cash. Biddle had started hinting that the funding might dry up, partly because Burgess had fallen in love with her. His business partner was now romantically involved with his primary investor. This went approximately as well as expected. Gulf used the car for promotional events, air shows, product demonstrations, the sort of thing that put a logo in front of large crowds. In late October 1933, arrangements were made to drive the Dymaxion to Chicago. A British aviator named Colonel William Sempill was arriving via the Graf Zeppelin, the famous German airship, and wanted to see the car. He'd be in town for only a matter of hours. A Gulf driver named Francis T. Turner took the wheel. Turner was 33 years old, a professional driver from Birmingham, Alabama. Married. 2 sons. He spent the entire night of October 26th, chauffeuring Gulf executives and Zeppelin passengers across Chicago, shuttling between the Stevens Hotel and the World's Fair. By the time he finally returned to his hotel, there was a note waiting. Colonel Sempill needed a ride to the airfield in the morning. The morning of October 27th, Turner picked up Sempill and a French aeronaut named Charles Dolphus, an attaché with the French Air Ministry from the Stevens Hotel. Dolphus found the car's appearance strange, but climbed into the back. Sempill sat up front. They headed south on Lakeshore Drive, 5 lanes, traffic moving around 40 miles per hour. The entrance to the World's Fair was visible to the east. Near the Field Museum, approaching a slight bend, Turner turned the wheel sharply to the left. Dolphus later testified they were avoiding another vehicle, but the geometry of that explanation didn't hold up. They were in the second outermost lane, well away from opposing traffic. The road was wet and greasy in patches. The most likely reconstruction is that Turner braked on a slippery surface. The rear wheel broke loose, and the car skidded sideways. The Dymaxion rolled. The canvas roof folded like paper. A driver named Meyer Roth, a shoe salesman from Chicago, was traveling behind them and struck the rolling vehicle, sending it tumbling further. The car came to rest in the northbound lanes, shedding its grille and windows. Dolphus, not wearing a seatbelt, was thrown clear. He struck the roof on his way out, split his chin, caught a gash near his eye, and somehow landed on his feet behind the wreck. Sempill was also unbuckled. He was thrown forward. 2 skull fractures. Turner was strapped in. The collapsing wooden frame and canvas roof came down directly onto his face. He was conscious when they pulled him out. He died later that day, at Mercy Hospital. He was 33 years old. Why did the newspapers tell a completely different story? That's where this gets dark. The press never mentioned that another car was involved. Not once. The headline, across New York and Chicago papers, was some version of the same story. Strange car rolls over, kills driver, injures foreign passengers. The design itself became the story. Investors pulled out. The money dried up almost immediately. Fuller flew to Chicago the next day. He visited the hospital, the crash site, and the garage where the wreck had been taken, though the South Park Commission refused to let him inspect it. In a private telegram to a colleague, he made a quiet admission that would never appear in any of his public statements. "Steel reinforcement over the roof canopy," he wrote, "would likely have saved everyone involved." He never said that publicly. Not once. When the inquest finally concluded, the finding was accidental death. The car's design was not officially cited as a contributing factor, but by then, 2 months had elapsed. The exoneration ran on back pages nobody read. Fuller, meanwhile, needed someone to blame. He began telling people that Turner and Roth had been street racing a claim with zero basis in fact. He transformed Roth, the shoe salesman, into a politically connected Chicago figure who'd had the car removed from the scene to protect himself. Also fabricated. He inflated the speed from 40 miles per hour to 70. He claimed Roth had deliberately rammed the Dymaxion's rear bumper. Dolphus, the only surviving passenger who'd actually been in the vehicle, remembered nothing of the kind. The coroner's certificate described Turner as having died while driving odd-type car for publicity. The truth sits in a harder, less dramatic place. The Dymaxion wasn't sabotaged, but it also wasn't what Fuller kept insisting it was. A near 20-foot vehicle with rear-wheel steering, a severely rear-biased weight distribution, a canvas roof with no rollover protection, driven by a man running on no sleep, on a wet road, at speed. The system had no margin for error. That morning, it ran out of margin. Fuller repaired the car. Gulf kept using it. He built 2 more prototypes with continued funding from Biddle despite the fact that Burgess had by now married her in Reno. A development Fuller managed to turn to his financial advantage by buying Burgess out under circumstances Biddle would later describe as exploitative. Meanwhile, he was telling anyone who would listen that 100 cars were already in production, most of them sold at $2,500, with prices expected to drop to $200 as volume scaled up. None of this was remotely true. 3 cars, hand-built, other people's money. Walter Chrysler reportedly explored the possibility of marketing the Dymaxion, but backed away, warning Fuller that a vehicle this radical would render every used car in America worthless overnight, threatening the entire dealer financing structure. Whether this represented genuine industry conspiracy or simply prudent executives declining to bet their companies on a 3-wheeled car that had already killed its driver, you can decide for yourself. Amelia Earhart specifically requested the Dymaxion as her personal vehicle when she received the National Gold Medal from National Geographic. The sculptor Noguchi took one on a road trip through Connecticut with Claire Booth Luce. Leopold Stokowski owned one for years. The car had a particular appeal to famous people who could afford to find it charming and who weren't depending on it to get to work every morning. 3 cars. That's all that existed. Prototype 1. The crash car was repaired and sold to an engineer at the Bureau of Standards. It changed hands several more times, ended up advertising soft drinks, and then caught fire during refueling in 1943. Burned to the frame. Prototype 3 covered a reported 300,000 miles across multiple owners, before being cut up for scrap metal somewhere in the 1950s. Gone entirely. Prototype 2 had the strangest afterlife. After its promotional tour, it vanished. In 1968, a group of engineering students from Arizona State found it on a farm. A farmer had purchased it for $1 and converted it into a chicken coop. He sold it to the students for $3,000, which he probably considered the deal of a lifetime. The car eventually made it into the collection of casino magnate Bill Harrah, which later became the National Automobile Museum in Reno, Nevada. It's still there today. For years. The museum kept the windows opaque because the interior had deteriorated so badly they didn't want visitors to see inside. Where are you watching from? Have any of you actually seen this car in Reno? Drop it in the comments. I'm genuinely curious. In 2010, architect Norman Foster, who had collaborated with Fuller for over a decade before his death, undertook the construction of what he considers the 4th authentic Dymaxion, not a replica in spirit. A faithful physical recreation, built from the same materials and manufacturing methods Fuller would have had access to in 1934. Foster's team photographed Prototype 2 more than 2,000 times, worked through the Dymaxion chronophile archive at Stanford, and tracked down every original off-the-shelf component they could locate. Most of the factories that once made them had long since been demolished. The parts were remade from scratch by Crosthwaite and Gardner, a firm that specializes in vintage race car restoration. In exchange for access to Prototype 2, Foster's team restored the original car's ruined interior, the one the museum had been hiding behind blackened glass for decades. Foster drove the finished car himself. He called it revelatory. He also described it as a beautiful object, something like a sculpture you could actually touch, which is a generous thing to say about a machine that killed its driver. In July 2025, the National Automobile Museum in Reno finally got Prototype 2 running again for the first time in more than 75 years. One drive, nearly a century after it was built. That timeline tells you something. Here's where Fuller actually got it right. The aerodynamic teardrop body standard on virtually every production car today. The obsession with fuel efficiency, 40 years before it became a political issue. Lightweight construction borrowed from aviation and marine engineering. Front-wheel drive, which wouldn't appear in mainstream American cars until the 1980s. The idea that a single vehicle could carry more people using less material and less fuel. These weren't wrong ideas. They were ideas that arrived decades too early. The Fiat 600 Multipla, built from 1955 to 1969, borrowed heavily from the Dymaxion's layout. The streamlined designs that transformed the industry in the late 1930s, the Lincoln Zephyr, the Chrysler Airflow owed something to what Fuller put on the road in 1933. Three-wheeled vehicles keep getting reinvented. Zaha Hadid's hydrogen-powered Z-Car, the Aptera electric vehicle. Neither broke through. The geometry that makes three wheels look elegant on a design sketch keeps colliding with the physics that makes them difficult to trust at speed. Here's what Fuller got wrong. Rear-wheel steering on a highway vehicle is fundamentally incompatible with safe operation above low speeds. Three wheels are inherently less stable than four. A canvas roof is not a survival structure. And designing a car as the preliminary phase of a flying machine doesn't improve the car, it just makes the car worse, while the flying machine remains hypothetical. Fuller never admitted any of this. Not in 1933. Not in 1953. Not when he was filling lecture halls around the world in the 1970s, with audiences who treated him like a prophet. He maintained, until the end, that the Dymaxion had been killed by a corrupt Chicago politician and a conspiracy of bankers protecting their investment in conventional automobiles. He claimed he had repaid every investor a claim that doesn't hold up to scrutiny. He rewrote Anna Biddle out of the official history entirely, telling interviewers he'd funded the project himself through speaking fees. His authorized biographies followed his version. Biddle vanished from the story. When sympathetic listeners told him they were sorry the car hadn't succeeded, he'd stop them. He wasn't trying to build a business, he'd say. He was running an experiment, and the experiment was a complete success. He learned exactly what he needed to learn. The Dymaxion was, as far as he was concerned, the most stable automobile in history. He went on to do genuinely world-altering work. The geodesic dome, which actually works, spectacularly. 28 patents. The Presidential Medal of Freedom. Carbon molecules named fullerenes in his honor, because scientists found the structure of the C60 molecule looked exactly like one of his domes. He became one of the 20th century's most celebrated design minds. But the car stayed with him. A wound that never closed, because he refused to let it. Fuller died on July 1st, 1983, at the age of 87. His wife Anne was lying comatose in a Los Angeles hospital, dying of cancer. He was sitting beside her when he suddenly stood up, said she was squeezing his hand, and collapsed with a heart attack. She died 36 hours later. They had been married for 66 years. The Dymaxion sits in Reno, Nevada. 19 feet of aluminum, built to fly and never got airborne. Designed by a man expelled from Harvard twice, who stood on the edge of Lake Michigan at 32 and decided the world still needed what he had to offer, and who spent the next 5 decades insisting that his greatest failure was actually his greatest success. He was wrong about the car. He was right about almost everything the car was pointing toward. The distance between those two things is the whole story. What do you think? Was Fuller a visionary who simply arrived too early? Or was the Dymaxion always more dream than machine? Leave your answer in the comments. And if you made it this far, you already know what to do. Subscribe. Because stories like this one are exactly what we're here for.